Welcome to episode 3 of Onomatocodeia, where we look at video game history through the lens of the tabletop. The Strong National Museum of Play, a museum devoted to the history and exploration of play through scholarly research, preservation, and hands-on activities, has inducted video games into the World Video Game Hall of Fame since 2015. They utilize criteria such as the game's influence inside and outside the video game history, the longevity of the video game or video game franchise, critical financial success, and more. If a video game has defined new ways to play, new ways of playing, or has introduced new audiences to play, there is a strong possibility that it already is, or perhaps one day will be, inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame. So, with the 2020 inductees firmly ensconced upon their pixelated thrones, I thought it would be a fun idea to do a short series of videos looking at each inductee into the World Video Game Hall of Fame, or more specifically, their board game adaptations. Because it is a good rule of thumb that if a video game has the chops to be nominated or inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame, odds are it has had at least some merchandising at some point in its life cycle. And while not always the case, more often than not, that merchandising will include some sort of analog adaptation in the form of a board or card game. Now, I do want to quickly say here that while I am doing this as a further exploration of the inductees into the Strong National Museum of Play's World Video Game Hall of Fame, that they are not involved with this video in any way, shape, or form, and that my thoughts and terrible editing are my own and do not reflect the museum, its employees, or anything else like that. But the museum is a really cool place to go to, a really cool place to check out, to see what they are doing, and I recommend checking out the links I am posting below. Now that we have that legalese out of the way, on with the episode. Bejeweled comes from a narrow window in time when the internet was more widely available, more accessible, more powerful, and flashy enough for more than just text and low-res images or BBS or Usernet forms or anything like that, but before the advent of smartphones and social media. So, roughly 1996 to 2006, give or take. Both events, smartphones and social media, are such watershed moments in so many ways, and how they affected both video games and play in general is without dispute. But that is perhaps best saved for another video. What I want to say here is that the advent of both technologies are important, change the realm of video games forever, and do bear some relevance to the story or video game in today's episode. Bejeweled was created right smack dab in the middle of this period in 2001. The company that developed that game, Popcap Games, was founded a short time earlier by Brian Fiete, Jason Kapalka, and John Vici. Before Popcap Games, Kapalka was working for a company called the Total Entertainment Network, later Pogo.com. It was during this tenure that Kapalka first encountered Fiete and Vici when they were trying to get their game Ark licensed and published on online platforms, and Kapalka was working as a producer looking for games to host on Total Entertainment Network or Pogo.com. After meeting one another during this time, several years passed, with Kapalka working at 10/pogo.com and Fiat and Vici working for Sierra for the World Opponent Networks, or 1.net. At the end of the 90s, 10/pogo.com was bought out by Electronic Arts, and at the same time, he reconnected with Fiat and Vici, and all three of them were tired with the status quo. They were tired of how the companies they were working for operated and wanted to start something themselves. To start their own game company and do the business of web games better than the companies that they had worked for. And in 2000, Popcap Games was born. But Popcap Games needed a game. And so they set about designing and programming some of their earliest games. And John Vici had recently played a game on the internet simply titled The Colors Game. The Colors Game sadly has been lost to time, and with it, an important piece of gaming history. However, what we can deduce about the Colors Game based upon its description is that it is in all likelihood a variation or permutation of Shiriki, or the Balls Game. Developed by Eugene Olemzin in 1988 in Russia, the version that made it to the West was released in 1994 on MS-DOS. It has all the hallmarks of the Match 3 formula. You have a field of icons where you are able to switch two of those icons, and if you line up three or more matching icons, those icons disappear and are replaced by more icons from the top of the screen. While at the time, the team was unfamiliar with games such as Puyo Pop, Panel de Pon, Columns, Tetris Attack, and Shiriki, odds are that the game that John Vici played was a poorly implemented, watered-down version of Shiriki or something like that on an internet platform. Regardless of what he played, the core mechanics of the Match 3 formula came through, and despite the presentation of the Colors Game, it was compelling enough to have Popcap Games begin developing a Match 3 game of their own, but that game was called Diamond Mine. When Popcap Games was farming their newly created game around to publishers for licensing on online platforms, they engaged in talks with Microsoft to host the game on Microsoft's gaming zone. However, one of the stipulations that Microsoft had was that Popcap Games change the name of the game. There was a previously published game called Diamond Mines, and legally, hosting a game called Diamond Mine was too close for Microsoft's comfort. Microsoft provided a list of names for them to choose from, and eventually the name of Bejeweled was settled upon. The then nascent Popcap Games agreed, partially due to the fact that they were going to be getting $1,500 a month in rent from Microsoft for having Bejeweled on the Microsoft gaming zone, but also they weren't really thinking about the longevity of their IP. They had created a game, they were getting money from it, they were then looking on to developing the next game to start licensing it out. The idea was if they created a game every few months and had 10 to 20 games licensed out to various internet platforms for $1,000 to $1,500 a month in rent, they could continue on comfortably for some time, perhaps developing passion projects or continuing to create even more games. They weren't really anticipating the IP of Bejeweled to last longer than a few years. No one could have predicted how big Bejeweled or Popcap Games would get. A miscalculation that Microsoft would come to regret. In June of 2020, the Bejeweled app for the iPhone platform generated more than 30,000 unique downloads and more than $9,000 in revenue from in-app purchases. This doesn't include revenue from advertisements or revenue from any other form of Bejeweled on any other platform. And in 2001, the picture was quite similar in terms of users anyway. Popcap Games was seeing 20,000 unique users on Microsoft's gaming zone playing Bejeweled generally at any given point in time. And again, this is in 2001, mind you, before smartphones, before social media, less users saturated the market, and as a result, this 20,000 unique users represents a higher percentage of the total market than it would today. Essentially what it boils down to is that Popcap Games knew they had a successful game on their hands and actually approached Microsoft at this point to purchase Bejeweled outright for $50,000. Microsoft refused. The dot-com bubble had burst, ad revenue was evaporating and disappearing, and as a result, Microsoft was tightening its purse strings and simply didn't want to spend $50,000 on an internet game, regardless of how popular it was on one of its platforms. So Popcap Games and Microsoft reached a different deal. Popcap Games would gain the rights to the name of Bejeweled, which Microsoft owned. Microsoft had provided the list of names, and Bejeweled was on it, and that was the name they had decided upon. And for the transfer of ownership of the name Bejeweled, Microsoft would gain the rights to utilize the Bejeweled architecture to essentially retheme it and reskin it for promotional purposes in an attempt to get more ad revenue and more bang for their buck from Bejeweled on their gaming zone, since it was such a popular game. So they created promotional versions of Bejeweled with new imagery and iconography within the game for companies such as Smirnoff Ice, Tyson Chicken, Purina Dog Chow, and the Pork Board of all people. However, as the years passed, Bejeweled only got bigger and bigger in terms of user counts, unique downloads, and income, far surpassing the $50,000 deal that Microsoft had turned down a few years prior. Not only was Popcap Games getting revenue from renting the game out to companies such as Microsoft, but they were also getting revenue by selling a deluxe version of the game as a downloadable game for $20 a piece. And while this might seem a little expensive for what nowadays would be an app on the phone, bear in mind this was during the era of dial-up. You had to utilize your landline to get on the internet. And so when you were playing Bejeweled for hours and hours on Microsoft's gaming zone, you had to be utilizing your internet, your dial-up, and your phone line. And if you wanted to enter your phone line, you had to stop playing Bejeweled. Having a deluxe downloadable version got around that problem. It got around the issue of having to utilize your phone line for hours on end to play Bejeweled, which many people were doing. And many people were happy to pay $20 to have the ability to play Bejeweled at any time of day or night for as many hours as they wanted to without taking up the phone line to do so. It was during a time when selling digital copies of what was essentially an internet game was a new and novel concept, or at least a new and novel concept for the average consumer. And it was a concept because of the times within which it was created, the fact that the internet was more widely available, more widely accessible, more users were getting online, and that pretty much all of those users had to use their phone line, had to use a dial-up modem to access the internet, to access Bejeweled. It was a concept that was incredibly marketable and incredibly profitable. And because of the profit margins that Popcap Games was seeing, it was essentially setting the trend on how many gaming companies were operating and trying to generate revenue, at least until the freemium epoch reared its ugly head in the 2010s. Popcap Games became a giant in the industry of casual games, helping in part to create them in the first place. They were an indie company when the modern independent gaming scene was in its infancy. They proved that an independent gaming studio could be a financially viable option for programmers, developers, and artists who wanted to try and create something outside of the big gaming studios. And over a decade after the first iteration of Bejeweled hit the surf, it was finally popular enough to warrant a tabletop adaptation.
The all-new Bejeweled game! Now, the app you love is a game you can play together. Be the first to swap out gems to match 3, 4, or 5 in a row. Collect the most gems and you win! Bejeweled! You'll even get a download for Bejeweled 3 digital game. Ask a parent before going online.
Upon purchasing a copy of Bejeweled, you would get 84 regular gems, 7 power gems, 70 scoring tokens, the draw bag, with the rules and the box, of course. In regards to the components, I like them fairly well. The game is visually appealing. It's enjoyable to look at and looks good on the tabletop. This is a game that would catch the eyes of passerbys at a gaming convention, and more often than not, most of those passerbys would instantly recognize the IP. Bejeweled is simply that popular and that well known across the world. If I had to give negative marks to Bejeweled, it would be for 2 things. First and foremost is the draw bag, which is a rather unappealing dollar store gift bag that is pretty plain and kind of cheap looking and is not very pleasant to touch or hold. I would have preferred a large cloth bag. If games like Super Scrabble and Quirkle can make a large bag full of larger tokens work, Hasbro could have easily made a large bag for Bejeweled. The second is the box, or rather the box's design. It is designed for store retail display first and foremost. The game's box has a large window to display the jewels that come with the game, but the clamshell that comes with the box forces you to play a game of perfection. Or throw that clamshell in the trash and just toss all the components into the box. And on top of that, how the actual box is designed, it is almost impossible to stack any other game on top of it without crushing the box. If I didn't know better, I would almost think that Hasbro intentionally designed the box this way to force prospective gamers to leave it on the top of their board game stack. Sadly, this is another case of form over function and shelf appeal over shelf space. So, ugly bag and subpar box aside, how does the game play? How does the Bejeweled game play? How does the Bejeweled board game capture the Bejeweled video game? The short answer, plays pretty good, like the browser version of the game. To set up the game, you fill up the board, ensuring that no matches and no power gems are present at the start of the game. The rest of the gems are placed into the draw bag, and the coins are placed to the side of the board for all players to be able to access them. On a player's turn, he or she will swap 2 gems, creating a match of 3 or more gems. They will then remove those gems from the game board and push the affected columns away from them towards the opposite side of the board. If that player sees that this created another match, they will score that match as well, repeating steps 2 and 3 until no more matches are present. Once the single match or chain of matches is resolved, the player will repopulate the board with new gems they have drawn from the draw bag. A player cannot create matches during repopulation. If the placement of a gem would create a match, that gem will be put back into the draw bag and a new gem will be drawn. Once a player has finished repopulating the board, they will then score the matches that they made on their turn. Depending on the colors that a player got in any given match, they will collect matching coins of the same color. 1 coin for a match 3, 2 coins for a match 4, and 3 coins for a match 5. And while the rules do not state the following rule, I had to find it online, but if your match contains a power gem, you will gain 1 additional coin for each power gem you successfully matched. The players will take the gems that they matched and place them back in the draw bag for a future turn. Once a player has made a match or matches, repopulated the board, and scored their match or matches, play will then pass to the next player and play will continue. If at any point no matches can be made at the start of a player's turn, then the 4 gems in the middle of the board will be removed and replaced with gems from the bag. If a match is made, then that player will be able to remove those gems from the board to score that match, and their turn will continue. The game will end when one player has successfully collected 3 coins from each scoring pile. And that is the Bejeweled board game from 2013. It captures the basic elements of how Bejeweled is played and adapts it competently enough to the tabletop. I mean, after all, what with the juggernaut known as Hasbro at the helm, one would expect at least a base level of playability. What the Bejeweled board game did was essentially take what is ultimately a solo gaming experience with a relatively basic goal in mind, keep matching until there are no more matches to be made, and turned it into a multiplayer game with a specific goal in mind, collecting 3 coins from each scoring pile. And while multiplayer is really where this game shines, pun totally intended, this is because with 4 players, there'll be a player on each side of the board, and so gems will be getting pushed up, down, left, and right during a single round during a 4-player game. Plus, with more players, you will have more people jockeying for the same gems and space on the board to try and make matches, to try and get the coins that they need to try and win the game, which ups the competitive factor for this game as well. However, what this game is lacking is really what the classic Bejeweled game is all about: solo gameplay. The Bejeweled board game has no solo mode for a single player. The fact that a board game is based off of a primarily single player experience yet has no single player gameplay is at least of note, if nothing else. Additionally, the power gems are not utilized in the same way as they are in Classic Bejeweled. Technically, Classic Bejeweled doesn't have power gems. Generally, it wasn't until Bejeweled 2 when power gems got utilized in a fundamental way. But in the board game, all they do is grant you a single additional power coin of the color that they were matched within. They do nothing to affect the board in any way, shape, or form beyond that. What would have been interesting is to have similar in-game mechanics for the tabletop adaptation as they exist in the video game. But beyond those shortcomings, the Bejeweled board game from 2013 is middle-of-the-road gaming experience that captures the gameplay of the classic video game and app well enough. The iconography and imagery and assets are there and faithfully recreated. The basic gameplay of the Match 3 formula that Bejeweled rests upon is there, and the multiplayer does add some depth and strategy, and is a way to experience Bejeweled that hasn't necessarily been recreated since. And insofar as Onomatocodeia is concerned, in the Bejeweled board game from 2013, there's really only one instance of it. And that is when a player is manipulating two gems on the board by physically swapping them to make a match. And this matches the programming very well from the app version of Classic Bejeweled, when a player is using a touchscreen on a smartphone or tablet to physically manipulate two gems to swap them and make a match. But beyond swapping gems to make a match, the Bejeweled board game really doesn't have any other instances of Onomatocodeia within it. And with that, we shall conclude the first episode in a series of episodes that looks at tabletop adaptations of the Strong National Museum of Play's World Video Game Hall of Fame's 2020 inductees, the first inductee of which was Bejeweled, and in the case of today's episode, the Bejeweled board game from 2013. As always, I thank you for watching Onomatocodeia, which is a series from the Arcade Castle, which looks at video game history through the lens of the tabletop. You can find us at arcadecastle.com, as well as on all relevant social media sites. As always, I thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.